So I'll get started here. One of the things I wanted to do with this talk was move away from the Paleolithic a little bit and look at cultural evolution in the Neolithic and really look at the ways in which culture has allowed people to adapt to novel habitats very quickly. And as you can see from this, from the title here, Moses the Microbiologist, Religion as Cultural Adaptation to Infectious Disease, I'm going to be looking at ways in which a lot of early religions, particularly Judaism and Zoroastrianism and some of the offshoots, helped early agriculturalists adapt to an environment with a high disease burden. The picture there is it relates to the biblical verse from Exodus, where God tells Moses to build a hand-washing station, essentially, a laver of bronze, and you should put water in it so that they shall wash their hands and their feet lest they die, and it shall be a statute forever to them, to him and his descendants throughout their generations. It's pretty remarkable that you have this injunction to wash your hands that is thousands of years old. Now, typically we think of the discoverer of hand washing as this guy, this happy-looking man, Ignaz Semmelweis, in the early 19th century. And if you open any textbook, then he's the guy that you'll see as the one who discovered it. And he was at Vienna General Hospital, and he oversaw there were two maternity wards. There was one maternity ward with high mortality rates and one with low mortality rates. The one with low mortality rates was staffed by midwives, and the other one was staffed by doctors, and the doctors would go in between delivering babies and performing autopsies at a morgue, and without washing their hands in between. And they didn't think there was anything wrong with this. So he saw these differential mortality rates and hypothesized that there were, quote, cadaverous particles that were being transferred from corpses due to the autopsy to pregnant women and young infants, causing high mortality rates. He was derided and ignored by his scientific peers. They thought he was crazy. The germ theory of disease hadn't been formalized, germs hadn't been discovered. Koch's postulates wasn't until the late 19th century. People thought he was crazy. He thought all these doctors were murderers, and he was committed, and 2 weeks later was beaten to death by the guards in his insane asylum. Now, so these hand washing, these findings had already been published thousands of years before in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible. Washing your hand, the injunction to wash your hands appears 3 times in different circumstances, usually to Jewish priests, but also to ordinary Jewish people, and these injunctions were extended to lots of different situations in daily lives, in people's daily lives. Avoiding corpses, Numbers 5:2, Leviticus 5:2, and isolating women after childbirth, also in Leviticus. So the basic tenets of what Ignaz Semmelweis, quote, discovered had been discovered thousands of years prior and were available in the most widely owned book in Western civilization. So this notion that hygiene and religion are very closely linked is an extremely old notion. There's the saying, cleanliness is next to godliness. It was actually said by a Protestant preacher, but it was probably derived from the Talmud. The Torah was formalized in the 6th century BC. The Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, was formalized about a millennia later, but it was based on an oral tradition that had existed for a very long time. Maimonides was a famous Jewish philosopher and physician who wrote about the hygienic value of a lot of religious rules in the Bible, in the Torah, in the 12th century. And then there's a book called The Healthy Jew in 2007, and and that's actually where I got the title for this talk. It's a chapter in that book, Moses the Microbiologist. And the book The Healthy Jew makes the point that despite a stereotype in much of the 19th century and early 20th century as the Jewish body and Jewish people as being physically small of stature, and at that time sometimes was referred to as degenerate, or viewed as vermin or diseased parasites, Jewish people actually had remarkable longevity and health, and lived much longer than neighboring populations. And so we're actually quite healthy. This is probably a good time for a quick note of humility. I'm going to make some pretty sweeping, propose some pretty sweeping hypotheses in this talk and cover a lot of material very quickly. But I'm covering 3,000 years of scholarship. This is probably the oldest continual theme of scholarship of hygiene and religion. So much of what I'm saying about hygiene and religious rules is not novel, it's not original to me, and somebody else or many other people have said it at many other points in history. I don't speak Hebrew, German, Yiddish, Aramaic. I'm not Jewish. The one thing that I do have going for me is that I look like a very famous Jew. And here ends the humble portion of the talk. So I'm presenting a hypothesis for the emergence of monotheism that I think is original. I'm not entirely sure. I've read a lot of books over the last 2 years about the emergence of monotheism, and I haven't seen it anywhere, and a number of other scholars have read it and reviewed it and say that they haven't heard of it either. So there's a little bit of text here, but then we'll move beyond that. A little bit of background. Infectious disease is a network phenomenon, and effective public health measures, sewers, vaccinations require coordination among nearly the entire population. So first claim is around the concept of sin. If a person were to break a scientifically sound religious rule, such as by touching a corpse or sinning, then that person would be more likely to become infected and die, i.e. punished by God. And God is capitalized because it's referring to a singular monotheistic God in this case. Claim 2, favored by God. If a corpus of cultural adaptations against infectious disease were sufficiently scientifically sound, and most group members adhered to such rules, then that group would suffer a lower burden of infectious disease than neighboring groups, and it would look like they're favored by God. And claim 3, around false gods. If praising other deities encouraged unhygienic practices such as sacred prostitution or tattooing, or ignored hygienic ones, then such false gods would actually be functionally incompatible with a true God who promulgated a scientifically sound hygiene code. So, real quickly, what I'm not arguing, because I get these questions a lot. I'm not arguing that all monotheistic religions originated this way. I'm going to be focusing on Judaism and Zoroastrianism and the offshoots of Judaism. I'm not arguing that hygiene is the exclusive driver of monotheism. I'm not arguing that polytheistic cultures cannot be hygienic. I'm not arguing that religious texts are literal history, that ancients understood or designed hygiene rules, that there's one interpretation of religious rules, that any one hygiene rule was perfectly effective, that all hygiene rules were partially effective, and I'm not arguing that I prove this hypothesis in the next half an hour. Some early examples of monotheism, just to orient yourself. There's not necessarily an inevitable push towards monotheism. For example, the first main example, Atenism in Egypt, was only lasted for 20 or 30 years during the reign of Pharaoh Akhenaten, and then different priestly classes reasserted the power of their specific deities, and that disappeared. You get the emergence of Zoroastrianism in Persia, Judaism in the Levant around a similar time, and there are a lot of striking similarities between Zoroastrianism and Judaism, and the rules were probably borrowed between them, or from one to the other. And then offshoots of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Though some people would say Christianity is not monotheistic, but with the Trinity, but we'll ignore that. And so what was the difference between monotheism, specifically around Judaism, and animism, which was the typical sort of spirituality of indigenous foragers, or sort of a soft polytheism? Well, in animism and polytheism, you have many spirits and deities. They overlap with each other, or they accommodate each other in people's worldviews. You can have multiple. You have a lot of household idols and different ways to worship them in their own specific ways. They're humans, they're personified, and I put emotional in quotes here, but they're driven by human emotions, and the dramas between them are very much human, and they're very common among pre-literate cultures. They don't require literacy. Now, if you look at monotheism, particularly the Jewish God, he's unitary and solitary. He's jealous. He also has a male instantiation. He's jealous. At the beginning, there are the Torah indicates that there are other gods out there, but the one true God is jealous and can't get along with the others, and then the others sort of disappear from the story. Very unsuperstitious. All the other gods are just false superstition that people keep reverting to. Faceless and formless, and very abstract and idea-based. The Jewish people have been referred to as a race of philosophers going back thousands of years. So a little background on infectious disease. When in pre-agricultural times, if this is how the world might look to a pathogen, you have these little hunter-gatherer bands that are separated by time and distance, and you have few hosts and few vectors between them. You get civilization, and the network gets much larger, more hosts, people, livestock, more vectors, water wells, trade, and that leads to more pathogens. And that was probably the greatest drop in reduction in health after agriculture was due to the rise of infectious disease. Now, around this time, you also get culture, ideas exploding in much the same way. Ideas operate in very similar ways to microorganisms. A small hunter-gatherer tribe can only support so much culture and technology given the limited number of minds. You get more hosts, minds, more vectors, writing, trade, and you get more ideas. And a lot of early cultural rules were a response to the rise in pathogens that had taken place. So some secular cultural adaptations. Spices have antimicrobial properties, so all these ethnic cuisines that are very heavily spiced probably were cultural adaptations to meat spoilage, particularly in hot climates. You see chewing sticks and toothbrushes appear, the emergence of drinking wine, beer, hot tea, which are sterile alternatives if you're to dirty water. And even co-evolving with microorganisms externally using fermentation as a way to preserve food. So there are lots of confirmed examples where ancient cultural practices were cultural adaptations to infectious disease. So now let's get into some of the claims. First, the concept that of sin being very similar to unhygienic practices is very old and very uncontroversial. I'm going to try to go over this as fast as possible, but this is one of the oldest themes in scholarship that for example, the law of Moses, or the Mosaic law, are the set of rules that are put down in the Torah, which allegedly was written by Moses. It wasn't. There are far more than 10 commandments. There are 613 rules, and about 15 to 20% of those concern purity or hygiene, which is quite a lot. And here are some of the principles of the Jewish purity code. There's this concept of things being clean or unclean, and you want to avoid unclean things. That's status. The unclean status is transferable through physical contact. There are purification rituals that can return you to a clean status, and it affects the entire community. Your business is my business, and vice versa. And they roughly overlaps with a good intuitive understanding of the germ theory of disease, that there are certain things that could be sources of infection or likely to be infected. The concept of something being contagious by slight physical contact, decontamination, and then the notion of public health requiring coordination among a large group of people. So what were some of the things that were unclean? Well, skin diseases, they called them laws of leprosy, but leprosy was probably a mistranslation, and they referred to a broader set of skin diseases than what we refer to as leprosy. That's a leper there and then a leper colony in the, I think, early 20th century. And you had to avoid contact with lepers. Bodily fluids were unclean. Eating blood was banned. Menstrual blood made women unclean. Semen, irregular discharges from the body, childbirth. A lot of people look back at the rules, particularly on menstruating women, as if it were this retrograde and foolish rule. And clearly, touching a menstruating woman will not give you cooties. However, this concern and obsession with bodily fluids may be more effectively thought of as an obsession with potential vectors of disease. And some of these rules quite likely benefited women at various points when they may have been more susceptible to infection. But some rules that didn't make sense may have been the cost of a generalized obsession with potential routes of infection. Feces, I was shocked when I went back and was reading the Torah. Also, you shall have a place outside the camp where you may go out, and you shall have an implement among your equipment, and when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it in turn and cover your refuse. This was an order to soldiers in the military, and in most wars, disease, not combat, has been the largest source of mortality. So getting soldiers to move away from camp and then go to the bathroom in a hole and cover it was a pretty smart thing to do. Tattoos, no marks on the flesh, or cutting the flesh is a sign of mourning. So whoever got this tattoo of a Star of David with a cross inside of it is deeply mistaken on many levels. And clearly, if you didn't have sterile needles or implements to cut yourself, or a sterile environment after you had cut yourself while you're healing, it's a very bad idea to purposefully expose yourself to infection in a high disease habitat. Corpses, you don't want to touch corpses. Man or beast. You don't want to touch human bones or graves. Those are unclean. You have to have a quick burial within 24 hours. An honor, which even extended to criminals condemned to death, benefited the living. And you couldn't eat animals or touch animals that die of their own accord or killed by wild beasts, which are frequently diseased or have started to already decompose. I've got a little picture of a zombie there. You don't want the corpses to touch you either. One of the biggest problems with the TV show, The Walking Dead, is that in reality, the characters on the show would be vastly more religious in that environment. They would be disgusted. They would have be very grossed out by the bodily fluids, the cut skin, the specter of death, and it would be a very tight-knit group of what we might think of today as religious zealots, and they probably would have been more effective than they are in the show. Cannibalism, they didn't actually even have to ban cannibalism, I'm saying that sort of euphemistically. Cannibalism wasn't banned in the Torah so much as it was used in curses as something that was assumed to be the ultimate sign of defilement. So you can't eat the flesh of sons and daughters, and pretty sure that extends to non-relatives as well, or the mothers eating the placenta. It says nothing about fava beans and a nice Chianti. Certain animals, rodents, most insects, the exceptions to insects are locusts, grasshoppers, and crickets, which feed primarily on plants and present a low disease risk to humans. And then a lot of the animals that were considered unclean, reptiles, birds of prey, bats, carrion fowl, and four-pawed animals, usually predators, carnivores, or at least omnivores. All of those species prey on, eat rodents, insects, or devour corpses. So there may have been an ecological reason for protecting species that devoured corpses. In Zoroastrianism, this isn't speculative. In Zoroastrianism, the way that you get rid of corpses is you take dead bodies to a mountaintop, or in this case, it doesn't work very well, a tower of silence, and you allow them to be devoured by vultures and wild dogs. So we know that it happened. And farmers know which species prey on other species and will devour corpses and carcasses. This is common knowledge if you're a farmer. Egyptian vermin disposal, cats became taboo because they preyed. They provided a useful ecological service. They preyed on vermin. And so if you don't eat cats, it's originated because a group of people protected a species that preyed on vermin. Sex was very unclean, even just typical sex. Even if you were married and heterosexual, it was still an unclean act. But sex, you do exchange bodily fluids. People didn't have protection back then. Adultery, prostitutes, bestiality. All these things were banned as immoral and evil. It also corresponds with a set of behaviors that, strictly from a scientific perspective, not a moral perspective, strictly from a scientific perspective, expose people to more vectors of disease. And a lot of these categories line up very neatly with what's been established through modern experiments as universal triggers of disgust. So food, body products, animals, sexual behaviors, contact with death or corpses. These words are not mine. These are quotes from a paper from the preeminent scholars on disgust, Paul Rosen, Jonathan Hayden, Macaulay, and disgust. It's well established now, evolved to be a quote, intuitive microbiology to keep people away, avoidance of things that could infect you. So transmission, physical contact, any physical contact between two things. Here's a real beautiful passage in the Zoroastrian Holy Book. I'm going to read it very quickly. It's how the purity code, it's the first two verses of their purity code. There dies a man in the depths of the vale. A bird takes flight from the top of the mountain down into the depths of the vale and feeds on the corpse of a dead man there. Then up it flies from the depths of the vale to the top of the mountain. It flies to some one of the trees there, vomits and deposits dung, and then a man comes up and wonders if he can take wood from that tree and burn it for a fire. And the question is this a sin? If there's a corpse and a bird preys on the corpse and the bird then deposits dung and vomits and then sits on a tree, is the wood from that tree contaminated and impure? It's a question of sort of 4 degrees of separation from the initial source of contamination. And the answer is that no, it doesn't, because if you had 4 degrees of contamination, then everything in the world would be impure, and you could touch nothing. Which is, they don't say because there would be 4 degrees, but the answer is that everything would be impure. Transmission, water and liquids, some of the rules of transmission vary. For liquids, it's considered water transmits uncleanliness more easily, but it's also used in purification rituals. There's this dual nature to water that you see throughout the Torah. And the picture is of people bathing in the Ganges, and it sort of gets at the dual nature of water. Yes, bathing is a hygienic practice, but if the water is contaminated, then it can also spread disease more easily. Open and closed spaces. This is the law: when a man dies in a tent, all who come into the tent and all who are in the tent shall be unclean 7 days, and every open vessel which has no covered fastened on it is unclean. So it took into account whether things were covered or not. And that's transmission through airborne transmission, only in closed spaces. By type of material, pottery is porous. If it became contaminated, it had to be thrown away. Bronze could be put through the fire, and then other materials, it sort of depended. So what were some of these purification rituals? Well, one of them was hand washing, Nobel-worthy commandment, injunction to run pure water over your hands. God wanted you to do this. God wanted you to bathe. This is an ancient mikvah from the Levant. Other purification rituals: sterilization by fire, Numbers 31. That same verse in Numbers was later interpreted in the Torah as putting things through the fire meant putting them in boiling water. This is speculative, but many of the sacrifices in the temple, before the temple was destroyed the first and the second time, you'd basically take a fat animal, you'd slaughter it, you'd burn it, you'd make sure to keep all the fat on the animal, and then you'd take the ashes and you'd mix it with water, and it made this thing called water of purification. And you put the water of purification on things, and then you had to wash it off again with clean water. And that's the process for making soap, or a soap-like substance. Quarantine is in the Torah. The passage of time, people can heal themselves. Even hair removal and nail care are mentioned, and are also in the Zoroastrian holy book as examples of things that bring on evil spirits. Even modern nurses today in the hospital have to keep their hair up and keep their fingernails trimmed to under 1/4 of an inch. And then there were mandatory public health measures: toilets, we've mentioned; burial practice, I've mentioned; food inspection to make sure that the food was kosher and not infested with insects; pest control, so protecting species that preyed on vermin. I didn't even talk about when most people think of kosher laws, they think of pigs or oyster or shellfish, and you don't even need to. We can debate that as much as you want. If the Jewish dietary code singles out insects and vermin and species that prey on them and gets rid of infected corpses, then you're doing well as it is. STD awareness, sexual practices, and then of course circumcision, which has been shown to reduce the incidence of HPV and HIV, though it does not reduce transmission of all STDs. And then personal hygiene on the Sabbath and other holy days. So one of the 10 Commandments is to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. And keep in mind that back then this notion of holy was very closely tied with being clean and hygienic. And so most people think of hand washing and these other rituals that you had to do before the Sabbath, bathing, laundering your clothes, cleaning the house, things like that, as something that you had to do in advance of prayer or in advance of the Sabbath. In Islam, you have to wash your hands and your forearms extensively before prayer. But maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's that prayer evolved as a way to get people to wash their hands. And it would have been enormously beneficial in an era when infectious disease was the top source of mortality. And kind of like parents have to tell children twice a day, they have to order them and command them and be very stern and say, brush your teeth. Why do I have to brush my teeth? Well, there are these invisible things on your teeth. And if you don't take care of them, then bad things will happen to you. So just do it. And they have to do this twice a day. And the Sabbath recurs every 7 days, and you have a stern voice that says, and now you must wash your hands, and you must bathe, and you must clean your house, and you must do all these other things, and you cannot come to this high status place in the center of our town unless you're clean. And so it really opened my eyes to what the New Testament was about and what Jesus did, because Jesus, his main one of his main sources of disagreement with the Jewish leaders of the time was this notion. He supported this idea that defilement comes from within, that it's a moral, abstract principle rather than something that you can get from external sources. So then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus saying, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." Jesus did not wash his hands. And it appears in 3 of the Gospels. In the same verses, he says that you don't have to wash your dishes. The Jewish dietary code disappears too. He says there aren't unclean foods. And even the moment where a leper is healed by touching Jesus, you have to remember the power of this concept, or this story back then, wasn't simply that Jesus had this magical power to heal. It was that he did something that you were not supposed to do, which was physically touch a leper, which is sort of the same concept of Mother Teresa in India. She touched the untouchables. And the Hindu caste system is a different cultural mechanism that addressed the same issue, which was infectious disease. And also circumcision in Galatians, that goes away too. So I'm going to move very quickly here because I want to have time for a couple questions. But that's the huge break, is Jesus gets rid of all of these extensive rules and hygienic practices in particular that made it very hard to be Jewish. You had to be literate typically to understand them all, 613 rules, all these do's and don'ts, and he just said, love your neighbor. And this also took place during the Roman Empire, a time that addressed infectious disease with secular technology like aqueducts and a secular religion of public baths. Okay, claim 2, favor by God. I'm going to move very quickly here. There is incredibly extensive evidence almost everywhere and in all the periods for which statistical data are available. The mortality of the Jews was considerably lower than that of surrounding populations. It's in a book called Genetic Diseases Among Ashkenazi Jews. Unprecedented tenacity of life. Here's some papers if you want to go look at the life expectancy advantage. 5 to 10 years relative to neighboring Gentiles, primarily due to a lower infectious disease burden, pneumonia, nephritis, typhoid, malaria, except diabetes, not a communicable disease. This was, I don't want to say it was common knowledge, but an article on a lot of these findings appeared in the Lancet in the early 20th century. And a lot of the public health codes, like circumcision, re-entered sort of the United States and the Western world as a result of many religious apologists in the late 19th century and early 20th century who acknowledged that a lot of these Jewish rules were scientifically sound hygiene rules. Jewish women have had, throughout history, had very low rates of cervical cancer, which is caused by an infectious agent called HPV, the human papillomavirus. It appears almost as if, back in the day, when they were measuring this, that Jewish women weren't having sex because they had such low rates of cervical cancer. They weren't having sex. There's a paper in Gibraltar, and then there are all sorts of unverified reports and rumors of Jewish folks having this mysterious immunity to pandemics and pestilence. Going way back in time, all the way to the Black Death. These are pictures of Jews being burned. They were scapegoated for the Black Death. It was said that they poisoned wells. People noticed that Jewish people in Jewish ghettos in different cities covered their wells, because in Jewish tradition, protecting your water supply was very important because it was used in so many purification rituals, and it was viewed as potentially transmitting disease more than physical contact. So what was a very sensible measure got taken as evidence that Jews were actually poisoning the wells in other parts of the cities. I'm looking for hard data on survival rates, which I have not been able to find yet. And then, of course, it goes back even further, because really the founding story of the people of Israel is that they had this mysterious resistance to plagues and pandemics in Egypt, which there's not evidence that they actually were in Egypt and enslaved in Egypt I'm not suggesting that, but many of the plagues described do describe reasonable vectors of disease like insects, and soon after in the Torah, you have God telling Moses that you've got to wash your hands a lot. So false gods. If praising other deities encouraged unhygienic practices, then it might be these false gods might actually be functionally incompatible with a true God. Let me give you an example of cannibalism that is happened in modern times and is uncontroversial. Cannibalism used to be a fairly widespread practice among pre-agricultural peoples. And Jared Diamond writes about that in the paper listed at the bottom. And the problem is, if you start living in cities and in high-density networks, infectious disease goes crazy, and most of the people who are dying are infected, and you don't actually want to eat them. So if you continue this practice of cannibalism, it's a good way to get diseased. And that's what happened among some New Guineans, the foray in the 1950s and 60s. They were eating the brains of their dead ancestors. It was a way of honoring them. It was a part of their religion, and they started to get kuru, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And you had some anthropologists there that sort of figured out what was going on and informed them that this practice, that it was killing them. And so you see a switch from a moral value where they were honoring their ancestors with cannibalism, and after the rise of infectious disease, it switches and it becomes a prohibited thing that you are not allowed to do, and it's a source of defilement. And there were some genetic changes too that made them less susceptible to this, but that's another topic. So some possible conflicts with false gods: sacred prostitution. There were reports of other ancient gods encouraging having sex with women, and if you're in a priestly class back then, that might be a nice perk of being a priest. Tattooing and cutting during mourning, another common practice. Eating blood was reported. So you could actually see how if your God had a scientifically sound hygiene code, it would functionally be incompatible with methods of praising other, quote, false gods. And then simply ignorance, if false gods were just completely ignorant of sound hygiene practices, you could have a similar dynamic where there were returns to believing in this, quote, one true God. So imagine, I'm almost done here, and if folks do need to run off to lunch, they can do so, but only a few more slides. Imagine if you went back to the 14th century during the Black Death, and you had the knowledge of scientifically sound hygiene. What would you say to people that they do, and what would you say is the cause of what's happening? Right? You'd go back there and you'd probably feel like Ignaz Semmelweis. And you would say, well, there are these germs. And they would say, what are germs? And you would say, well, there are these invisible things, and they're killing you. And they'd be like, evil spirits? And you'd be like, kind of like evil spirits. And they are causing everybody to drop dead. Well, what's causing them to drop dead? Well, you're trying to simplify things. You're like, well, don't touch corpses, right? Stay away from them. Burn them, bury them, get rid of them. The Black Death was spread by fleas on rats. So knowing this, since you're paid attention in history class, you would tell them to stay away from certain species like vermin and insects. And they would be like, well, what's wrong with these species? Well, those have the evil spirits too. They're dirty, they're unclean, stay away from them. And, and what are simple things that you can do? You're not going to build a sewer system or anything like that. You don't have that power, but you could tell them to do something very simple and effective, like wash your hands obsessively multiple times throughout the day, because your life depends on it. If you don't do it, you're going to die. And bathe, and wash your clothes. And so if you think about, there is a sort of a person who has experienced this feeling even today, and it's Bill Gates. And if you think about his work in the developing world with the Gates Foundation, he's basically going into areas with a very high burden of infectious disease. And there either aren't the resources, either infectious disease is understood, but there aren't the resources to combat it, or it's not very understood very well. Toilets, bathing, staying away from mosquitoes and insects, malaria, sexual practices. It's no longer, no, people don't like to tell people how to behave sexually anymore, but condoms, definitely issuing condoms and trying to make it seem from a pathogen's perspective like sex isn't actually taking place. Hand washing is an effort that he's supported, clean water, and even vaccines. One of the struggles with think of his mentality going in there. There are all these different little ethnic groups, and they all have their own little religions. And Bill Gates goes in there and says, no, you don't understand. There's a right way to do it. There's one right way to do it. And you have to wash your hands, and you have to bathe, and you have to have clean water, and you can have all your household idols and things like that, your fertility goddesses and stuff like that. But there's one way to do it. It's very abstract. You've got to follow these list of rules, and you'll live longer, and you'll stop dying so much. And one of the challenges that he faces with vaccines and eradicating polio is that there are a lot of little mini religions throughout the world that have an intuitive sense of contamination. And vaccines go against that intuitive sense. People don't want to get vaccinated because you're being contaminated with something evil that is going to kill you. And you get a lot of similar feelings in the anti-vaccination movement in this country, without realizing that a little bit of contamination can actually save your life. So some implications on this are on the origins of religion. Thornhill and Fincher have written interesting papers on in-groupishness and assortative sociality, Jewish history, theology. The difference of the concept of redemption in Western and Eastern cultures probably derives from the fact that in Jewish and by extension Christian and Islamic religions, you can redeem yourself in this life. And a lot of this stems from this notion that in Judaism, that through correct conduct, you could go from unclean to clean and back to unclean again. Whereas in, say, the Hindu caste system, that probably evolved for the untouchables to do all these dirty jobs, grave digging, waste disposal, butchers, tanners. They were a biological bulwark against infectious disease, and they did those jobs for life. And so in more Eastern Hindu theology, you get redemption in the next life because you sure aren't going to change your caste in this one. Jewish IQ, if Jewish people start living longer and have lower mortality rates 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, then the returns on investing in human capital go up, education, literacy. There's data that Jewish people made the infant mortality, the sort of typical demographic transition from having high infant mortality rates to low, and then you end up having fewer children, but higher quality children, and investing more in them. So they made that transition earlier, and then and that led to other benefits. Public health, I've mentioned some of those. Political beliefs, a lot of interesting work by Jonathan Haidt and others on how our sense of disgust is very closely related to our political beliefs. And if you look at a lot of small c conservative views around the world, not just in this country, conservatives tend to have a higher stronger disgust reflex, and a lot of conservative views line up with being grossed out by things that a few thousand years ago, or even 100 years ago, would have been vectors for disease. And so it may be a heuristic for surviving in a high disease burden habitat. And then various moral issues, if you want to think about expanding the moral circle these days, then maybe one of the best things you can do is what Bill Gates is doing, which is lower the infectious disease burden in other areas. So I'll end it there. I have a more detailed discussion of this in my book, which comes out in a month, the Paleo Manifesto, and it's a fun read. It's a good read. So if anybody wants to hang around and ask some questions, you couldn't possibly have any questions after that. But if you do, I'd be happy to answer them.
We'll actually take the questions outside so that the AD group can
Okay.
work. So
Come find me if you have